Well, this was also sort of beefed up a little bit during the Public Health Service Act in 1996, which prohibited government institutions from discriminating against institutions like hospitals, who said, we don't want to train or refer for abortions. Many of the Catholic hospitals would fall into that banner. It also, get this now, protected a doctor, also a student or resident, from being discriminated because they refused to make arrangements for IEE referrals for abortions. Okay, so you had protections there. Well, again, this came up again in the Weldon Amendment as our healthcare insurance was all changing in the United States. They said, well, we're going to extend these protections to other healthcare providers, okay, nurses, PTs, pharmacists, okay, as well as insurances if they choose not to cover abortions. Okay. Well, that was going along pretty well until something very interesting happened in 2007. In 2007, the American College of OBGYN, ACOG, decided to release an opinion, an ethics opinion. Okay, now this ethics opinion was interestingly titled, "The Limits of Conscientious Refusal in Reproductive Medicine." And at that time, if nothing else, that title should have gotten your attention. Because remember, from the founding, you say, yes, one of the most important things is protecting your conscience against the civil government or anything else. All of a sudden, ACOG, the very title says the limits. Okay, wait a minute, hold it now. The limits of this conscientious refusal. Okay, so what did they say? Here's what it said. That physicians and other healthcare providers have the duty, okay, another important word, and this is a legal term. Okay, stop for just a minute. You have the duty. Now, what does duty imply? Obligation, culpability. So the duty implies that if you don't do that duty, then you have been derelict in that duty or negligent in that duty. You see, duty here is inserted as a legal term. This is big time. First, the title, there's limit. Second, there's a duty. Okay, so you got to pay attention. You have the duty to refer patients in a timely manner to other providers if they do not feel they can, in conscience, provide the standard reproductive services defined as, of course, abortion, that the patients request. Providers with moral or religious objections should either practice in proximity to individuals who do not share their views, or should ensure that referral processes are in place. So what are they really saying? This ethics opinion by ACOG said this: right of conscience, after all, is just a personal opinion. Okay? Remember what I explained before. We had Roe versus Wade say, okay, abortion is now legal. So we have patients with a desire for a procedure. And since the founding of our country, we've had the protection of conscience and conscientiously practicing physicians here. And they're coming like this. Which one wins? Okay. Well, it was very clear, okay, to the pro-abortion crowd that they were not winning. This was still here. So what did they try to define to do? Instead of right of conscience being an actual right, they say, actually, right of conscience is actually a preference. Okay. So now you have a right of healthcare access over a physician preference. Which one wins? Right? So this was their argument, that it's just a personal opinion after all. They also said that patient autonomy is the way to finally resolve this dispute. Patient autonomy. Okay. Now you hear a lot about autonomy, but the problem that they made in this particular one is they equated negative autonomy with positive autonomy. Now what does that mean? Well, negative autonomy is this. It's the patient's right to refuse a procedure. So Dr. Smith says to Mrs. Jones, I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones, we've discovered a tumor, a malignant tumor in your abdomen. We need to remove that tumor because it's going to spread, shorten your life, and you will likely die if we don't do something. So in physician beneficence, Dr. Smith has explained to Mrs. Jones that this procedure is recommended, and here's why. Now, because of negative autonomy, Mrs. Jones has the right to say, thank you, Dr. Smith, I understand. I understand what you're saying is the obligation here, what may happen if I choose not to, but I'm simply just too concerned about this procedure. My family doesn't think I should have it. I do not give my consent for this procedure. Okay, now what's going to happen? Is she going to have the procedure or not? No, she's not, because of negative autonomy. Okay, negative autonomy is a good thing. To say you need to have something done, and you have the right to say, no, thank you, for whatever reason. I don't want to have it done. Okay, that's negative autonomy. However, positive autonomy is this. Positive autonomy is the patient's right to demand something. Okay? And in almost all situations, okay, positive autonomy is trumped by physician beneficence. In other words, the idea that the physician is going to make a recommendation based on their training, expertise, and scientific knowledge. So what's another example? Mrs. Jones comes in and says to Dr. Smith, Dr. Smith, I'd like to take out my spleen. Okay. Well, why, Mrs. Jones, would you like me to take out your spleen? Well, because it kind of hurts, and I'm worried I might get a tumor there, and, I just want it out. And Dr. Smith says, Ms. Jones, you don't have sickle cell, there's no tumor, you're not bleeding, there's anemia. We really don't have a reason to take it out. I understand what you're telling me. However, the risk to you is up here. There's almost no benefit. So even though you want this out, I cannot in good conscience take it out. So which one's, is she going to have her spleen out or not? No. And that's positive autonomy. But it is trumped by physician beneficence. Okay? So here, all of a sudden, they've defined that positive autonomy is the final arbiter here. Just because the patient wants it means they should have it, and it trumps physician conscience. Another problem with this. Well, this seems almost ludicrous, that if you are practicing and you choose not to perform abortions, you must pick up your practice, move it in proximity to someone to whom you can send for abortions. Okay? This raised a lot of concern. But then get this. But it's just an ethics opinion, right, of ACOG. Okay? It's a big statement, but until a few months later, when the American Board of OBGYN released an update on their maintenance and certification. Now, certification is a big honking deal, right? If you are board certified, you can have hospital privileges, you can get reimbursed for insurances. If you don't, you may not be able to get any of that. So here's what they said. They released some stipulations on which your certification can be denied. Nothing wrong with that. If you have incompetent physicians, we do not want them to be board certified. So they can say, well, you can lose your certification by the American Board of OBGYN for cause. Yeah, well, that's fine too, right? If you're incompetent. But what about this? Cause in this case may be due to a violation of the American Board or the American College rules and or ethics principles. How coincidental do you think this was that this came out just a few months after the ACOG ethics opinion? Not at all. Not at all. You see, so this raised big concerns, and they have, to this day, refused to clarify whether this would apply to a pro-life, life-honoring, life-respecting physician. So because of that, much in response to this, the Bush administration recognized this. Many doctors brought this to their attention, and they passed some provider conscience regulations to extend safety to people who are practicing in accordance with their conscience. Basically, we already had the laws of the land. It wasn't an issue of the laws, but as I read to you those stories, consciences were still being violated. And people were being told, no, you don't have a right to refuse in this. You must. People were being fired because of their stances. Even though we had a law on the books of the land, it was not being implemented. So the Bush administration put in these rules that explained how these would be implemented and what would happen if they weren't kept. It defined the terms, and it made very clear who was protected under the healthcare right of conscience. Well, unfortunately, you know what happened in January 2009 is, as he had promised when Obama came into office, he said one of the first things we're going to do is revoke the provider conscience regulations because it limits access to healthcare. And there was initially an outcry, and so they slowed the process down a little bit, took a survey and left open for comments. They got hundreds of thousands of comments online. And in fact, 2/3 of the comments were opposed to changing that rule, the Bush-era rule that I just showed you. Nonetheless, the Obama administration gutted those protections in February of this year. They removed that broad scope of conscience protections. All they left in place really was what would happen if you thought you were discriminated against. So what problems does that what problems arise now? What problems do we have here with the law? Remember, those laws are still on the land, but now you've had an executive decision here by HHS that's having an impact. And what it's done, it's narrowed these conscience protections specifically to abortion only, okay, and to some parts of assisted suicide, not even the whole thing. Unfortunately, it ignores or either removes religious objection convictions to other things like prescribing abortion-inducing medication, contraception if you're opposed to that in certain situations, sterilizations, okay, euthanasia, participation in embryo research. Okay, a host of other moral implications were simply just glossed over by this, and this is where we stand right now. Well, why do I tell you this? It is important that you, as students, be informed, okay, that you understand our times, like you've heard from some of the speakers at the conference, like the men of Issachar, who understood their times. This is not to be afraid. This is not to batten down the hatches of what's happening. We just need to be informed, okay? So we'll talk about this. But what about your colleagues? This was another important thing, too. I'll just mention that it did remove clear protection for residents who declined to train in abortions. Okay? So we did a survey of almost 3,000 healthcare professionals, most of which were doctors. And three real consensus things appeared from this. It was very clear. Number one, that conscience protections are fundamentally necessary in the medical profession. 9 out of 10 physicians agreed. They said, I would rather stop practicing medicine altogether than be forced to violate my conscience, like some of those stories we shared earlier. 32% had been forced to refer to something they found morally, ethically, religiously objectionable. 26% had been forced to write a prescription for something they found morally, ethically, religiously objectionable. 17% had to be forced during their training to do this, and actually 12% had been pressured to actually go ahead and perform as their primary operator of something they found morally, religiously, or ethically objectionable. The second thing we found out as we surveyed all these healthcare providers was that discrimination not only present in practice but also in medical education. 39% of people said this. They experienced pressure or discrimination by faculty or administration during their training. This was interesting. 33% have considered not pursuing a career in a particular field. In other words, saying, I'm in medicine, I'm moving through, going to residency, but I'm not going to do X because I may be forced to violate my moral integrity. Almost a fourth had experienced some discrimination in the application progress, and 1 out of 5, this is really telling. It said 1 out of 5 students said, I am not going to go into OBGYN because I'm concerned I might be forced to compromise my moral, my religious beliefs. So they're steering away from it. That's a huge, huge problem because we are already underserved with women's health care in our country. So you hear people talking about, well, access to contraception. The interesting thing is what came out, okay? In fact, as some of these cases have gone through, there hasn't been a single case reported of a woman being denied a contraception prescription or emergency care because of religious objection related to abortion. Not a single case. Yet that's what they cite as the reason why we must get rid of these conscience protections, because it's a healthcare access issue. What I'm going to tell you is that the access issue will be there when pro-life, religiously motivated physicians pull out of things like OBGYN and or medicine because they don't want to compromise their God-given moral integrity.